Good morning. Keep the vibe. Good morning. Okay, I welcome you to our 6th day, and we are coming to an end, towards the end of our summer school. We would like to thank you for keeping with us, walking this journey, and we hope that you found it very insightful. And this morning, we are going to have our first lecture. And this is our own that we have listened to before, Professor Faustin Maganga. Thank you so much. Please keep the vibe. Professor, you are welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Resti. Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here again for the second time. And what I'm going to do this morning is what you can call light duty, because I'm going to present on expansion of conservation areas and its impact on pastoral communities in Tanzania. And I won't be alone here because my colleagues will give me covering fire. Professor Howard Stein, we are together developing a paper. Actually, what I'm going to present right now is a work in progress, because we are writing a joint paper which is called, tentatively now, we just call it the conservation paper. But afterwards, when we are through, we'll be able to give it an appropriate name. And what I'm going to do right now is just to highlight some of the contents of that paper. And actually, a lot of the insights are coming from the previous, our research project on transformation of poverty and property rights in Tanzania. Happy also, I don't want to preempt the later conversation, but we have Dr. Emmanuel Sule, PhD from University of, which university in South Africa, Dr. Sule? Okay, yeah, you're with Aga Khan, but you are Western Cape, a university in Cape Town. So he's also going to give me covering fire, because we've been together in some of the areas where I'm going to cite examples from. So the outline of the presentation is, as you can see, a few remarks on introductory remarks, and then I'll actually highlight the size and characteristics of the Tanzania's conservation, what I've called conservation estate. And the conservation estate in Tanzania includes the national parks, the Ngorongoro Crater Conservation Area, the game controlled areas, the game reserves, the wildlife management areas, and then nature forest reserves. And I think we have an opportunity to be able to compare, because I know Uganda also has got its own conservation estate. I know you have national parks, probably game reserves and so on, so we will be able to learn from your experience. I'll say a few words about basics of wildlife conservation in Tanzania, and then the role of international donors and conservation NGOs, which we have given the name BINGOs, big international NGOs. Yeah, the role that they've played in expanding the conservation estate in Tanzania. Then I'll say something about the implications of this expansion on livelihoods of pastoral communities. And I'll highlight some of the interventions that have been tried to assist pastoral communities. I think that's a topic of interest. And then I'll say something about legality versus legitimacy. You know, you can be imposing what you say, this is what the law says, But then is it legitimate on the people that you are trying to impose your legal regime? And then we'll conclude, and then I'll highlight some of the references that we have used in our forthcoming paper. So introductory remarks have 5 points regarding introductory remarks. Number one is about the basis of this presentation. It's part of the our project on transformation of property rights and poverty in rural Tanzania. Then point number two is that the demarcation of village boundaries and formalization of individual property rights has not had the expected security effects. You know, remember we highlighted that probably when you formalize rights, then we'll have the expected security effects. There won't be land grabbing and things like that. But from our findings, we've found that that has not been the case. Point number three, we note the difference that has happened. Tanzania mainland, when we got independence, we were just 9 million people. And by 2022, we are more than 60 million people. So the population is growing very rapidly and relying on the same land resource. So you can see the population has increased by 15 million people in just 10 years. Point number four, we are saying since colonial times, various areas in Tanzania have been demarcated and mapped and gazetted as reserves land and under formal jurisdiction. But over the past 20 to 30 years, there has been large increase in reserved areas, and I'll have an opportunity to show how large the conservation estate has grown. And the last point, introductory point, is that the expansion of conservation areas and the rapid population growth has made life worse to the affected communities, because I'm going to say something about that. Yeah. So 3 points about the size and characteristics of the conservation estate. And I'm saying the conservation estate in Tanzania is composed of 21 national parks, big, huge interest. The Ngorongoro Conservation Area, 29 game-controlled areas. Game-controlled areas are areas where the pastoralists could also graze. But over time, laws have been put in place to restrict the use of game-controlled areas. And then game reserves, 21 game reserves. These are where the government, the cash cows of the government, because this is where the hunting concessions are awarded. And the government is very, very keen to expand these game reserves because they bring money. And then 22 wildlife management areas. Management areas are what is supposed to be village land. So sometimes when people say, what is the size of the conserved area in Tanzania, you can talk about the general land or the conservation area, but actually wildlife management areas are on what is supposed to be village land. So it's also a form of, reserved land. And then 23 nature forest reserves. And I'm noting there also the contrast with Uganda, and we can learn from Uganda. And point number two is that there have been divergent views about the actual size of the land under conservation in Tanzania. For a long time, the government has been saying 70% of the land in Tanzania is village land, 28% is general land, and only 2% is reserved land. But this figure is not the reality, and we've seen that the figure is much more. And actually, we are saying more than 44% of Tanzania's land is covered with game reserves and national parks and so on and so. At least almost half of the size of the country has come under conservation, with implications, negative implications. So that's a map that we have in one of our publications, showing that actually village land is about 60, that was back in 2013. Village land was about 60%, reserved land was 35%, and general land about 5%. But bear in mind that what is called village land also contains the wildlife management areas, which have got their restrictions and so on and so forth. So a few words about the national parks there, and then a map that will be improved when we finish our paper, showing the location of the national parks. But then we had a figure of 22 national parks, but one of them has been degazetted because, national parks are areas where you just have photographic tourism and so on and so forth. You can't have consumptive utilization. So, but they discovered that one of the national parks actually had minerals, so the government decided to degazette so that they can go and exploit the minerals. And then Ngorongoro, that's a cover of a book by Henry Fosbrook, who was the first conservator of Ngorongoro Conservation Area, and he actually called it Ngorongoro the Eighth Wonder. And it's one of the cash cows of the country. A lot of tourists that come to Tanzania, they want to go to this crater, the Ngorongoro crater. But then the surrounding area, Loliondo and so on and so forth, the catchment area of Ngorongoro is an area of great contestation. And Ngorongoro is established as a multi-utilization area where pastoralists could also graze their cows, and then there will be some areas for wildlife conservation. But over time, the agreement for this multiple use of Ngorongoro has been faced with more and more restrictions, because as more and more livestock increases, then it threatens, the conservation status, and threatens and actually the politicians say the tourists come here to enjoy wildlife, not to see cows. So evictions, so a number of pastoralists have been evicted from Ngorongoro, contrary to the agreement that was reached when it was first established as a multi-utilization space, with a lot of negative effects. So there's when you finally get these slides, because I'm going to leave them, you'll have a history of Ngorongoro and when it was established and so on and so forth. But the main point is that this is an area that was established for multiple utilization, wildlife conservation, plus grazing for the pastoralists. But over time now, things have been changing. Yeah. So I won't waste much time about that. And then the second category is game reserves, which I'm saying they've been established with the core responsibility for biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of wildlife outside national parks and Ngorongoro. And what game reserves entails managing a total of that much area, comprising of and there's a table there listing the number of and size area of the game reserves. And as I say, this is a cash cow for the government, because this is where the hunting concessions, and we have figures of how much the government is getting in terms of how this, professional hunters pay to the government. And recently, I think there was a big hullabaloo when the largest crocodile in the world was killed, and this professional hunter, proudly displayed the picture of this piece of trophy. Then game controlled areas, as I said, these were areas where there's a lot of wildlife, but pastoralists were supposed to be allowed to graze. But over time, there have been restrictions now. There is coming a time when you can only graze in game-controlled areas with express permission from the government. You can't just graze there. And then wildlife management areas, as I said, these are areas where you have some of the village land situated on corridors where animals are moving from one conserved area to another. So the villages which are located along these corridors are facilitated to create these wildlife management areas where they put regulations about how to utilize the piece of land. Yeah. And then the philosophy is that under wildlife management areas, the villages are also given possibilities of benefiting from the income that accrues from the wildlife management areas. But as we shall see, the so-called benefits are minimal. And then there's a map there showing the extent of wildlife management areas and so on across the country. You will be able to see it in the slides which I'll leave. And then nature forest reserves are also another category. These are areas also where there are restrictions. You can't just enter these reserves. And something of interest there is there's the list of forest nature reserves and the size. If you are interested into that category, you can follow up. And as I promised, I said I would say something about the basics of wildlife conservation in Tanzania. Point number one, wildlife is economically valuable. And we have figures of how much the country gets from wildlife, but the question is how that money is how much accrues to the government and how much goes to the communities which bear the costs of protecting the wildlife. And point number two is wildlife is costly. If you ask the livestock keepers, you have predators, you have lions, invading their bomas, killing wildlife, and so on. Lives have been lost because of conservation of wildlife. Wildlife is mobile. That's another point. You can see we call them nyumbu in Kiswahili. Wildebeest, the migration of wildebeest between Kenya and Tanzania. And a lot of tourists like to go and watch this seasonal movement of the wildlife. Yeah. So wildlife is normally defined as a public good, but as you can see, there are few people who position themselves to benefit from wildlife. And you can see the lion there, the king of the jungle. For the tourists, they are very, very excited to take pictures and so on and so forth. But as I said, also, this king of the jungle can also be a cost. And for the Maasai Moranis, if the king of the jungle invades the boma and kills wildlife, they can sort them out. And when they sort them out, in the course of our research, we did make a documentary which we called The Chairman and the Lion. We were a bit scared because in that particular documentary, we actually interviewed an old Maasai, a former Morani, Maasai Morani who had succeeded to sort out a lion that was killing livestock, and we feared for his safety because he could be arrested as a poacher, by the government. So luckily, I don't know, maybe Howard will share experience how we managed to protect our informant, but we did make a documentary about the cost of living with wildlife. Yeah. These are the points that you'll see in my slides. I don't want to waste time. And then also in the slides, you'll be able to see human-wildlife conflict. And this is from an area where Dr. Sule and myself have worked, the Enduimet Wildlife Management Area. And you can see there, maybe you can't see, it's not so what, but you can see. So the number of farms that were being destroyed by wildlife, number of goats and sheep that have been, number of people who have been injured, people who have been killed, and so on and so forth, just to emphasize the cost of living with wildlife. And this is one wildlife management area. It's not even a game reserve, it's a wildlife management area on village land. And these figures are documented about the costs of living with wildlife. And an interesting and mischievous point here about the role of international donors and conservation NGOs, the bingos, in expanding the conservation estate. And in Tanzania, we always like to say that, Mwalimu Nyerere, the father of the nation, the first president of Tanzania, issued this statement, Arusha Manifesto, that we people of Tanzania are going to conserve wildlife for the coming generations. But what has been documented is that IUCN was heavily involved in drafting that manifesto, which is now the father of the nation is given credit for. And then, of course, Mweka, the Mweka Wildlife Management College in Tanzania. You have the hand of the African Wildlife Foundation. You have also WWF, WCS, and so on and so forth. They were heavily involved in the creation of these wildlife management areas. United States Agency for International Development, DANIDA, GIZ, and so on and so forth. Frankfurt Institute was very much involved in the Serengeti and so on and so forth. So for our German colleagues, you've been there. You are the contribution of Germany is acknowledged, but also they should also assist us to alleviate the challenges of setting up these protection areas. So I'm listing there the list of facilitators for WMAs, AWF, AfriCare, and so on and so forth. You can see WWF heavily involved. So the point to note is that some of these big international conservation NGOs heavily involved in facilitating the expansion of that conservation estate in Tanzania. And then now people are talking about climate colonialism, red and red plus. I have a story to share with you. There was an article that was published, The Red Menace. And there's a very interesting story about that particular article that was published in Global Environmental Change, especially for you upcoming upcoming scholars. A good friend of ours, Ian Bryson from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, supervised Betsy, one of the authors of that particular article, and which was critical about the role of WWF in setting up one of these red protection areas in Tanzania, and the negative impacts on local communities. And lo and behold, the pressure that Betsy had to endure. And for the first time, you can see the muscle of these bingos. WWF wanted to, ever heard of a situation of depublishing a paper that has come out as a publication, and they were trying to get it out. So that's the kind of pressure Betsy and the co-authors had to face. So that's just to show that these bingos are very influential, and they are very sensitive to negative publicity. Yeah. And I think I'll try to conclude now. I have a slide on the implication of conservation on livelihoods of communities. And there are some maps there showing, actually the point I'm trying to show is that the villagers, sometimes they don't know, because the people who are involved in conservation, they are relying on these maps. And the villagers are not very sensitive about how these maps are being constructed. So end of the day, they suddenly are told this area has been mapped as conservation area, this area is sensitive, this is ecologically fragile, and things like that. And so we visited one of the villages that was facing this problem, because it was being mapped for conservation without their involvement. Because these are, they're supposed not to be. And then another case study that our paper will show is the expansion of Ruaha National Park, and amount of village land that was taken out to be protected under the expansion of the national park. And there's a table showing village areas affected by the extension of the park. So much village land was taken with negative impacts on the villagers. And I share some of the points about evictions. I stole some of these slides from our colleague Kelly Askew, who is not with us, but she's going to be a co-author of the paper that is coming. So we're talking about Usangu, the eviction, Ulanga, all over the country. We have also documented evidence about the eviction of herders, which was inhuman. People's livestock lost, and property lost, and so on and so forth. And these are documented in the newspapers in Tanzania. So a lot of evidence about the negative effects. Pastoralists vow to resist eviction. So sometimes there are clashes between, in Tanzania we call them vyombo vya dola, the armed guards and so on. Yeah. Some figures that you'll find, number of tourists and so on. And then a point about half of the hunting concessions are on village land. So the villagers see these rich professional hunters hunt on the village land, but the income does not accrue to the. And then I'll say something about interventions that have been tried to assist pastoral communities. There's a paper that we published in Africa. It's called Of Land. Okay, it's not coming. Still a problem? Yeah, it's there. Yes, there's a paper that we published. It's called Of Land and Legitimacy, A Tale of Two Lawsuits, published by Kelly Askew, one of our colleagues, myself, and Rie Odga. And in this particular case, we documented a case where pastoral communities were able to go to a court of law and stop, the invention of their land by cultivators. So this is one of the rare cases where you could get justice from the court system. So we thought it was a good point to document. A summary of that article, you'll find it there. I don't want to repeat it. And then I suggest you also refer to this scholar, Jim Igo. Jim Igo, he published a paper some years back titled Scaling Up Civil Society, Donor Money, NGOs, and the Pastoralist Land Rights Movement in Tanzania. But he has published other, including a book, I think. And he's talking about how now these NGOs which are supposed to lobby for the interest of pastoralists, how their agenda is hijacked by donor money and so on and so forth, and their agenda is diluted. So he has some cases, he cites some cases about how they were able to dilute the effect of these activist NGOs which support the cause of pastoral communities. And basically, he is documenting how the pastoral issues in Tanzania started with the taking up of the area in a place called Basuto in Hanang district. By lo and behold, our first president was a good friend of Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian prime minister, and they traveled with him around Mbulu and Hanang, and they saw, Tanzania was suffering from food shortage, and they said Canada is going to assist Tanzania to grow wheat on this potential area. But that particular area was a grazing area for the Barabaig people. So a huge chunk of land was taken to establish these wheat farms, and there was about 30 to 40% Barabaig people were displaced by this huge wheat farm with good intentions that we want food security for the country, but with negative implications for the livestock keepers. And then now a number of NGOs were set up to try and fight for the cause of pastoral communities, especially the Barabaig. But then Jim Igo is now tracing how these NGOs, their cause was diluted over a course of time. So I'll conclude now with saying that there is a difference between legality and legitimacy. For local communities, they say, okay, this is our ancestral land. We have rights, we have connections to this land. We have burial grounds, we have graves on this particular land. We have been residing on this land for so long. And then if people come now with legal documents and maps and so on, like I showed, and they say, no, this is we can assist you to move the graves elsewhere. But this is a very fragile area that needs to be conserved. Yeah? So you end up with those two perspectives. One camp, they are talking about, they are guided by legality, others are guided by ideas of legitimacy. So I have a few points there about the difference between legality and legitimacy, which you'll be able to see. And I've concluding comments there. Number one, conservation implies that local people's access to such areas is being either banned or put under various forms of restriction, and that whatever local land rights and other rights to natural resources in these areas previously existed are nullified. That's point number one. Point number two, conservation is one form of formalization of property rights which has posed and increasingly is posing a threat to local people's legitimate and legally recognized customary land rights. Point number three, the expansion of conservation in combination with forms of and processes of formalization of property rights presently taking place in Tanzania leads to direct dispossession of local people, also to spillover effects, and that this again is leading to increasing conflicts between different types of land use and land users. And then point number four, empowerment processes in which villagers participate through land boundary demarcation and land use planning are being undermined by excessive use of force and misuse of power by authorities involved in implementation of conservation efforts. And then I have a number of references which I don't want to repeat, but you'll find in the slides some of the references, including this paper of land and legitimacy, where we are comparing what are the legal arguments and which was legitimacy points. Thank you so much.
Now it works. Thank you, Faustin, for your lecture. And we have about half an hour for questions. So whoever has something to say, I will come to that side first.
Thank you, Professor Faustin, for presenting to us about conservation. I have two questions to maybe your thoughts about this, or what your study found out. What did you find, or did the study find to be some of the key drivers of expansion of these conservation areas in Tanzania? I take this and compare with Uganda, where such expansion, I may not be aware, but I have not read or even heard about this, although government protects these areas very much. And then two, what were there some, or what could be the reactions of the communities that are displaced due to expansion of the conservation sites in Tanzania? And then finally, I also wanted maybe you to clarify on, you said under control areas, you can only graze in those areas with permission from the government. How does this happen? You know, how easy is it for somebody to ask permission and start grazing, maybe in a conservation or protected areas? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. So, have there been instances where these conserved areas have been deconserved or degazetted, and then the land perhaps leased to private individuals or investors, perhaps in the name of developing the land and so on and so forth? And if they do, which implications have these had on the people, but also the environment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for taking us through that wonderful discussion. Indeed, Africa and generally East Africa is endowed with a lot of resources. And like we have shared with us about the reserves which are in Africa, and particularly in Tanzania, and also in East African countries, we are all aware that because of the pressure that humanity has caused onto the conservation, has either caused or led to the depletion of some of the reserves that we have. And we also see, for example, in Uganda, where in some situations the government or people in power can force the residents to get out of the reserves where they are staying, or even where places that are not reserves, because they are in power, they can evict them to get out of such places. But in such circumstances, you find that the government can engage, in quote, the investors. They may be local, they may be international, who actually may be coming under the ticket of investing something that is development of the community, but when it may not necessarily benefit the locals. We have seen in Uganda where our wetlands have been given out for maybe sand mining. For example, here in Wakiso, we have had such scenarios. Others have been given mountains for stone quarrying, and etc., and etc. Now, like you shared with us that, like in Ngorongoro, where the wildlife has been affecting negatively to the community and vice versa. Now, in such a circumstance, do you think the academia house has got something to do to change the status quo? That is question one. Then two, you also shared with us about the bingos, the big international NGOs, which actually do play a very important role in making sure that the environment, the ecosystem is conserved. How effective do you think we can collectively and efficiently mobilize the efforts of all the different stakeholders to make sure that we are able to conserve the ecosystem in Uganda without depleting it? I submit.
Thank you for the questions. Faustin, do you want to take time to answer first, and then we'll take another round?
Hello. Am I on? Yes, thank you. Yes, I'll respond, but I think I'll also, because this is a joint paper, I'm sure Professor Howard may interject if I'm leaving out any important point. So the first question that I got is the key drivers of this expansion of protected areas. For me, I would say number one is on the part of the government, it's the economic value. I didn't share with you the amount of money that the government, the tourists bring to the government. Is quite considerable. There was a time, our chief export commodity is gold, but tourism brings in a lot of money. Tourism in two aspects. You have photographic tourism, where tourists go to the national parks with their cameras, take photos and so on and so forth, enjoy the scenery. But we also have, consumptive professional hunting. These professional hunters pay exorbitant fees to the government to be able to kill some of these animals. And actually we do have, I had this point that, wildlife is mobile. We have animals on a part of Tanzanian side of the border, but some animals cross over to Kenya. And we have been having some issues with the Kenyan people, because hunting is prohibited, is illegal in Kenya, completely is banned. Tanzania allows, responsible hunting. Yes, so policy-wise, the two sister countries have issues. So even the mountain, I displayed the Mount Kilimanjaro at the beginning of the, Mount Kilimanjaro used to be on the Kenyan side of the border, and I think it was given as a gift during the colonial times. It was given as a gift to Tanzania. So that's why we allow the Kenyans to use it to promote tourism. Come to Kenya and see Mount Kilimanjaro. So anyway, what I'm saying, the first part is economic. For the government, they get a lot of money from tourism, both photographic tourism as well as from professional hunting. Number two is also the role of international, conservation lobby. I just mentioned a few of these bingos, but also the donor countries, they do play a heavy influence, in pushing agendas for instance, Red Plus, or and so on and so forth. You have a lot of money being poured in the country and to try and promote some of the conservation initiatives. So a lot of forests are being curved, to protect for carbon sequestration and things like that. So the international lobby, both not just bingos, but also the donor countries, they play a big role, and they do influence a lot. And I don't know, maybe they put conditionalities. Before you can get aid, you need to practice, responsible conservation practice. So two sides of that coin. So the reaction to restrictions on game-controlled areas, I didn't tell the story of how, some of these conservation areas, are promoted. They start out as saying that this is a game-controlled area where you have, relaxed utilization. You can graze, and also you are not supposed to kill the animals. So there, the protection, regime is not very, very tight. And then this area all of a sudden is mapped and elevated to become a game reserve. So when it becomes a game reserve, there you are not supposed to have your animals. It's just it's wildlife and no animals. It's a game reserve, and it is protected by guards. Some of these guards are heavily armed and so on and so forth. And then a game reserve can also graduate to a national park. Yeah. If it's a game reserve that has potential for professional hunting, it can remain as a game reserve. But if it's for other sorts of protection, then it's promoted to become a national park. So you have these stages. Yeah. So the reaction. I think that's a story for another day, because as you can see in the slides that I showed towards the end of the presentation, there've been people have fought back. They've not just done nothing, and some even academics. Some academics have been very, very critical to the government. Have written critically, and they've suffered consequences. You can suffer the consequences when you are towing the line which is contrary to the line of the powers that be. So there's been a reaction, but suffice it to say, it has not been a passive or an exercise that has not had resistance. Another question was about cases of degazettement. Yes, there have been cases of degazettement. My friend Dr. Walwa there knows he's actually, thanks to him, he's the one who told me that you're talking about 22 national parks. One of them was degazetted because it happens to have minerals. So, but I think also some of the game reserves and the game controlled areas under President Magufuli, he allowed some villages to take over. He said, we don't have the capacity to protect all these areas, and the villagers are sitting there, needing to utilize this land. So there have been cases where villagers have been allowed to take what was previously a protected area. And then there's been a question about investment which should benefit the communities. Unfortunately, that's quite a challenging situation, and I'll invite my colleagues maybe to respond to that. But our government, I think, when locals, it is locals versus investors, and then you have a government that does not so much care for the needs of the locals. It's a very difficult struggle. We have a lot of cases where the government has sided with the investors to the detriment of the interests of the locals. You need some voices to be raised, but then you have a lot of cases where critical voices have been silenced. When I was doing this field work on this Enduimet wildlife management area, which is on the border between Tanzania and Kenya, the animals go to which national park? Amboseli National Park in Kenya, and then they come to Tanzania. When I was doing my research at that WMA, I talked with a brilliant lawyer, Tundu Lissu, who is a prominent opposition member in Tanzania. Yeah, and I got a lot of very, very good points, and he's one of the people who empowered the people in that WMA to demand their rights. He's a smart lawyer. He knows the areas where the communities can at least squeeze some benefit from the protection, and he actually empowered. And I had a very, 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 very fruitful discussion with Tundu Lissu when I was doing my fieldwork there. But he's now in the opposition. He's fighting one battle against another, vis-a-vis the government. So it's a sad story. It's one of the advocates who could actually really fight for the rights of the communities. Yeah. And I think I'll end it there, and maybe Howard, you want to chip in?
I'm going to add a few things. Thanks, Faustin. A very rich presentation and response to the questions. I want to put a kind of broader conceptual framework on what's transpiring in Tanzania. What is actually quite remarkable is the enormous dispossession of land under village control. We're talking about 25% of the land. So village control went from roughly 70 to, we think it's probably 45% of the land over a few decades. The government likes to continue to talk about the fiction of villages having 70% of the land. There's lots of land in Tanzania. I don't need time to go into that. But there isn't. In 50 villages, in the nearly 50 villages that we've visited, we didn't find any excess land anywhere. And what has transpired basically is you have a series of mechanisms, some would say primitive accumulation. It's a mechanism by which they are moving land outside of the control of the villages into other purposes. And what's central in understanding reserve land, which is the biggest amount, 45–50% now of the land in Tanzania, is that in some senses it's not only generating revenue for the government. What it does in some senses is that it provides revenue for the private sector. And understanding how tourism is in fact largely basically the resources themselves and the parks become inputs into the tourism dollars, which are then often controlled both domestically and also by international capital. And in some cases, the money never even comes to Tanzania. Tourists sign these contracts, they have these relationships, pay the money abroad, never enters into Tanzania. Massive amounts are lost. So the land then becomes part of, in Tanzania, land that's formerly controlled by the villagers, for pastoralists and a variety of different cultivating activities, is now lost. And the government has been extraordinarily, and what I'd argue is that there's a whole series of different ways in which the dispossession has transpired. Because you need to also talk about, as William has talked about, the movement of land from villages into urban areas, which is another way in which there's been a massive increase. More than 10% of the land today is in general land. We used to talk about it as being 2%. So there's been this whole effort to change the nature of the control and the rights over it. And when a park is created, and Faustin mentioned, all of a sudden you can't do any grazing on it. So in areas where pastoralists for millenniums, for hundreds and hundreds of years have been grazing their cattle, is now lost to them. And if you look at the vast majority of the villages, they do not set aside pastoral land. There's this whole idea of, you should become ranchers, right? And hence you should have this fixed area, which is very, very costly, problematic ecologically. And so now they've created this enormous punitive measures of fining tens of thousands of shillings for each piece of cattle that is found within the boundaries. It's created a lot of conflict, sometimes killing, sometimes violence against pastoralists. It's very, very problematic. But this broad framework really needs to be understood of the movement of the control and the rights over land by one group at the time when you've had a massive increase in population, as Austin has said, into an entire control by the government and the private sector for the circuits of accumulation and production. And understanding this broad framework and how it's systematically done. And if you look at, I want to make one final point. If you look at reserves, and reserves and the creation of parks have a great international cover because it's legitimate. We're saving the animals, we're preserving them for the future. Of course, that's important. But in fact, in some cases, it's a mechanism to legitimize dispossession and the seizing of land. And we know in the case, for example, of Ethiopia, you had a situation where they would use that as a mechanism to pull the land away from the villagers and then privatize it, and sell it off. And the same thing, the mining example is just one, in which you took an entire national park and turned it into the property rights for the mining and for the private sector and the government. And so understanding the mechanisms, legitimacy, the legal routes for dispossession is incredibly important, understanding the movement of the concentration of wealth of land from one group to the next. That's what's really happening in Africa, and with enormous consequences to the livelihoods of people living in villages in Tanzania. So I'll shut up there, but it's important to understand this very broad framework in the context of wealth and the dynamics of wealth inequality, what is going on in Tanzania, and how the nature of wealth and accumulation of wealth and the circuits and flows of production and income are actually then intertwined with these broader transformations, and who actually controls the land, what the land's purpose is. So I'll shut up there.
All right, thank you for both of your answers. I think we can have time to take one more round of questions. So, gentleman in the back with the microphone, start.
Frank again is my name. A student of land eviction and pastoral livelihoods. A student at the Open University of Tanzania. Thank you, Professor, for this presentation. And also to bring the attention that I think all African governments are the same in promoting anti-people policies, especially the anti-pastoralist groups on the African continent. When you look at the national parks, and the reason you have given that is economic, is very okay. My experience, I was in Arusha. I traveled to Moshi. Then we ended up heading to a tour on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. There are very many vehicles and very many people heading there. And via tourism, you can see that really there is a lot to do with attracting money. We seem to have very good numbers of tourists recorded, but we don't have recorded numbers of pastoralists being evicted from the adjacent national parks. So my question is, thank you so much for this, to deal with tourism. But how come national parks, their boundaries theoretically are known, but they are not fenced such that they coexist with the other groups, especially pastoralists? It is also happening in Uganda here. Recently, I was in Karamoja, around Piano Upe. The same story, where the animals move out of the national parks boundaries and they attack the livelihoods of the common pastoralists around. It is also happening in Arusha National Park. Around 2009 to 10, around 600 number of heads of cattle died as a result of East Coast fever, tick-borne disease coming from the wild animals, where the governments are smiling at the expense of the suffering of the people. So the question is, what is so hard since governments are getting more money from tourism to fence these national parks such that wild animals can coexist with the groups that they have marginalized and pushed out of their lands? And secondly, what in your study, what is the livelihood options for those people who are chased from these national parks? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful presentation. From your presentation, I heard that the government accumulates a lot of money from tourism. Are there any resettlement action plans for the evicted people? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, from the first presentation, it was clearly showing that in the 1960s, by the time Tanzania got independence, almost Tanzania had 9 million, but currently it is running over 90 million people. And when you have to look at the percentage, that's almost 50 million that has increased on the population. And if you have to look at what's going on, the villages, the land villages has reduced from 80% up to 60%. The natural resource reserves is almost increasing to 35%. But as my colleagues have talked about, what is the plan and what as conservation is being done, we are not looking at that point where people are being considered for. We will give us an example of Golongolo, where this place was majorly going to be coexisting with the nationals and with the people, the national parks, and also the people who are supposed to be in that place, and also the conservation is supposed also to take place. But currently, if you look at that place, currently they no longer allow people. More land is being taken away from the people, and the people are not being given an option. This is the country where almost 0.8 people are being increased on their population each and every year, but the land is being taken away from the people, being given to the conservation of the environment, considering about conserving the environment and promoting tourism. What about the normal people? How are they going to counter this poverty that is increasing? We're having a lot of poverty, we're having a lot of hunger, it is affecting a lot of people. This is caused by the taking away land from the people. The pastoralists, the people who are doing out culture, so like who are doing out environment, who are doing out planting, the people no longer have enough land. What is going to affect? Isn't there going to be a lot of poverty that is going to increase among the people? Aren't we going to be having a lot of rural-urban migration, having a lot of the youth who have no land that is going to be catered for? So is more conserving an environment being taken more of advantage than the people alone, lacking enough land to do about the activities? Thank you.
I think if we can do one final question here, because I've promised it since the very start, and then we give it over to you, Faustin, for your final answers.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. Martin Chamanywa is my name. Towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned very important concepts. The concept of legitimacy and the concept of legality. many of the problems which we are having about land issues, land dispossession in Uganda, in many African countries, largely it is this legality, the idea of legality. I have the title, I can go to the courts. It has caused a lot of suffering to the people. So I think it would really be a step in the right direction if our leaders, the various actors, if they really promoted this concept of legitimacy in handling these land issues, because being legal is not necessarily being right. Secondly, you mentioned about animals crossing, wildlife crossing between Kenya and Tanzania. Somebody mentioned about the Amboseli National Park. In your study, have you explored, are there mechanisms within the framework of the East African setting that can help to jointly and effectively manage this wildlife with minor antagonism? And then finally, the professional hunters. The government is promoting professional hunters alongside the conservation, and these contradictory and these countering against each other. And when you talk about the responsible hunting, how is it done? Who is there to count maybe the number of animals or the types of animals somebody is supposed to kill? Really, how practical is that responsible hunting? Thank you.
Over to you, Fasin.
Thank you so much. Very, very good questions. And I don't pretend that I've answers to all the questions because I'm also learning. But there's a point about, buffer zones between where the animals are and where the people live, and trying to fence off, suggestions to fence off the wildlife area to minimize problems from the wildlife to the communities. Yeah, what I can say is that what we have observed in Tanzania is that the people who are promoting conservation, they also promote the concept of buffer zone. For instance, the Ngorongoro Conservation Area has got like a catchment area where the animals, might wander off from the crater and back and forth. And then you have places like Loliondo. I didn't say anything about Loliondo. It's a very contentious area. This is an area where the professional hunters come and so on and so forth. These are the areas that surround the conservation areas. And you'll find out a lot of these, what I've called wildlife management areas. These are village areas which are on the buffer zone of the protected areas. They promote these WMAs to enable the animals to have free movement. For instance, in Tanzania, we have Lake Manyara National Park, and the animals, these animals move from Lake Manyara National Park. They go to Tarangire. I think that's where they're having their calves, and then they come during the wet season. Then Ngorongoro, the Lake Manyara National Park is waterlogged. The animals move out. They go to Tarangire, and then when things become too dry in Tarangire, they move back to Lake Manyara National Park. And in between the two national parks, you find there are a number of villages. So the people who are promoting conservation in Tanzania, they work day and night to make sure that this corridor is opened for the animals. In order for Lake Manyara National Park to survive and Tarangire National Park to survive, you need to open up this corridor. And so that you find a lot of these bingos and all these NGOs that promote wildlife management areas, they concentrate to make sure that they empower or they whatever they do to ensure that whatever villages are situated on this corridor, they are opened so that the animals can move back and forth. So the idea of fencing is not on the agenda of the powers that be at the moment. There's been a question about any plans for people who've been displaced by conservation. Yeah, if you've been to Tanzania, you've been to Zanzibar, what you'll observe is a number of Maasai, who have been employed as guards. The Maasai, they have this reputation of being fearless. They can hunt lions. They can do all kinds of things. So many of them now being employed as, guards in people's homes or in properties in Zanzibar and places. This is a sign of people who should have been, pastoralists raising animals, surviving on their pastoralist activity, being displaced and being, forced to take up alternative employment positions and very marginalized positions. These are the ones who guard your homes when you are sleeping peacefully at night. And if you talk about what kind of plans the government will have, the government will tell you, yeah, these people, pastoralism cannot survive. If they want to raise animals, they should be sedentarized. They should settle down, yeah, and practice modern livestock keeping. And you will find the plans that they have is, plant grass for the animals. There's some varieties of grasses that need to be planted. Reduce the number of cows that you are keeping. Have a few fat cows, but this idea of moving around with 120 cows, heads, and so on is outdated and cannot be sustained in modern times. So they've got plans about modernization, plans about sedentarization, settling them down, and so on. But plans about mobile livestock keeping systems, I'm yet to hear about those. I've heard a lot of plans about modernizing them, making them modern, and planting grasses, reducing heads, and so on and so forth. Yes, the idea about legitimacy vis-a-vis legality, I couldn't agree more. Maybe I didn't give a lot of hints about where where my heart is. My heart is not with these people who intimidate people with these maps. First of all, they generate these maps without the participation of the people. And the maps that I showed of villages around Tarangire National Park, actually the villagers, they still have old notions about how far they can go with their cows. They've not seen these maps. We got these maps from the people who are responsible for conservation. They've been developing these maps, and then all of a sudden, they'll come with these maps and say, this is where you can settle, this is where you can graze, this is a no-go area. So there's no legitimacy from the side of the people. And these are the people imposing their powers of map reading and so on and so forth on the locals who are supposed to be ignorant. They don't know Google positioning and so on and so forth. Yeah. Any other point that about possibility for utilizing the East African community to co-manage the resources? Yeah, what I can say, we have this love-hate relationship with our brothers and sisters to the north. The Kenyans have their way of doing things, and we have our way of doing things. And you can see the issue of hunting versus banning hunting is one of the issues. It's not to say that the Kenyans are superior conservators. They have their laws about banning hunting, but what from the hints we have is there's a lot of illegal hunting taking place in Kenya as well. Thank you. Howard, do you want to chip in?
I just want to make one or two very quick points and examples. There are other models and modalities of integrating local population so they can still actually utilize the land. So we know there's models in which you allow grazing on the parkland at certain times of the day so that in fact then local populations have access to it. There really is a lot of these, when we look at these village land plans, there really were very few areas set aside for pastureless grazing. You know, every bit of the land is taken. There's also other models, such as in Gombe National Park, Jane Goodall, who actually then set up a model of a cooperation, participation, and economic activities related to the area. So she actually ensured when they actually put the park in, that local population had new types of livelihoods integrated and associated with the park. Austin did work in this area. You can talk about it even more in a project on that. And so thinking outside the box, one of my colleagues, Bilal Budd, has written on Kenya, you know, the idea that simply land in a park is something which has to be free of any cattle and not considered to be part of it. It'll in some ways vitiate the tourism experience if they see a cow in a park. And in some ways, that vision has to transform, you know, so that there's an understanding that from the external players that we're dealing not only for the welfare of the animals, we've got to think about the welfare of the people and how they're affected as we conceptualize these reserves in parkland areas. I just want to say that. Austin, you want to talk about the Gombe case a little bit, or might be useful?
Yes. Thank you, Howard, for reminding me. I worked with an area that, you know, I don't know, I think I should pick something up. Jane Goodall is a celebrated, you know, conservationist, but who is really into protecting the chimps who live in a very fragile, you know, ecosystem in Kigoma, and she set up this protected area, but with a lot of projects, conservation-friendly projects, so that the communities, you know, bringing back, you know, benefits to the communities. So it's a model. It's a model that whoever wants to study, you know, conservation with positive impacts to the communities, the Jane Goodall model is something that you want to focus on. And there are quite a number of interesting projects for women, project for the youth, project for entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth, to engage the communities so that they don't go, you know, and chop down trees and destroy the habitat of the chimps in the Gombe National Park. So yeah, it's a model that whoever wants to write about, you know, conservation with development, it's a model that you want to study. Thank you.
Okay, then I think that was it for our first lecture. Another round of applause to Faustin. And we're going to have about 20 minutes of a break right now. There's tea and snacks outside. You can quickly get some of that, but let's try to also be back in the room as quickly as possible for our next and then also last lecture by Mr. Emmanuel Saleh. you.